The morning sun was warm on Haven 7 when the first ships appeared in the sky. The colony world had been peaceful for 40 years. 3 million humans lived there among forests with golden leaves and lakes that sparkled like glass. Nobody expected what came next. Commander Lisa Monroe was eating breakfast with her team when the alerts started screaming. She dropped her coffee and ran to the command center. The screen showed Veltari warships, dozens of them, descending through the clouds. But something was wrong. They were not heading for the military base. They were not targeting the power stations or the factories. They were heading for Sunrise Valley, the retirement community where 1,400 elderly humans lived quiet lives. Lisa grabbed a transport and flew as fast as the engines would allow. She was too late. By the time she arrived, the buildings were burning. The gardens where old people had walked that morning were covered in ash. The reading rooms where grandparents had told stories to visiting grandchildren were nothing but rubble. Lieutenant Jake Harris met her at the edge of the destruction. His face was pale and his hands were shaking. He had been one of the first responders. How many? Lisa asked. Her voice did not sound like her own. Jake looked at his tablet, but he already knew the number by heart. 1,412. Every single resident. The youngest was 67 years old. The oldest was 103. Lisa felt her legs go weak. Her grandmother had lived in Sunrise Valley. She had moved there 5 years ago because it was supposed to be the safest place in human space. Lisa had visited her just last month. They had walked through those gardens together. The communication device on her belt crackled. Admiral Samuel Price's voice came through, heavy with pain and anger. Monroe, I need you to hear this. It's not just Sunrise Valley. We have reports from New Oslo and Brightwater settlements. The pattern is the same everywhere. They hit nursing homes. They hit hospitals. They hit schools. Lisa closed her eyes. Schools? Elementary schools. Daycare centers. Children, Monroe. They killed children. The final count came in over the next few hours. 23,000 dead across Haven 7. Most of them were over 60 years old. Most of the rest were under 12. The Veltari had not touched a single military target. They had not destroyed any factories or power plants. They had killed only the old, and the young. Dr. Catherine Palmer was the one who figured out why. She had spent years studying Veltari culture, and she had intercepted their communications during the attack. When she explained it to the War Council, her voice was shaking with rage. They don't see it as murder, Catherine said. In Veltari society, anyone who cannot work or fight has no value. The old and the young are what they call dead weight. Their strategists believed that killing our vulnerable populations would make us more efficient. They thought we would thank them for removing what they see as our burden. Admiral Price stood silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his words were quiet, but they carried the fury of every human who had heard the news. They thought wrong. Within 24 hours, something happened that had never happened before in human history. Every government on every human world voted to join together. There were no arguments. There were no debates. 400 colony worlds became one united force in a single day. They called themselves the Terran Coalition. The message to the Veltari was simple. There would be no peace talks. There would be no negotiations. There would be no surrender. The war would end only when the Veltari understood exactly how badly they had miscalculated. On Earth, an old man named Harold Trent watched the news with tears running down his face. He was 80 years old. His sister had lived on Haven 7 in a small apartment near Sunrise Valley. She had been 78 years old, and she had spent her retirement painting watercolors of the golden forest. When the coalition announced that they were accepting volunteers of any age for the emergency corps, Harold was the first person to sign up. The recruitment officer looked at him with surprise. "Sir, are you sure? This is going to be a long war." Harold looked at the young officer with steady eyes. "My sister was a painter. She never hurt anyone in her life. They killed her because they thought she was worthless. I'm going to show them what worthless can do." Millions of people followed Harold's example. Retired soldiers came out of their quiet lives. Former engineers left their gardens and returned to their workstations. Grandmothers who had worked in weapons factories 50 years ago rolled up their sleeves and went back to work. But it was not just the old who answered the call. On New Oslo, a 16-year-old boy named Marcus Lee stood in the ashes of his elementary school. His little brother had been inside when the Valkyrie ships came. His brother had been 8 years old, and he had wanted to be a pilot when he grew up. Marcus walked to the nearest military recruitment center. He was too young to fight, but he was not too young to work. They put him in the intelligence division, analyzing data and tracking enemy movements. He worked 16 hours a day without complaint. When someone asked him why he pushed himself so hard, Marcus just shook his head. "They killed my brother because they thought kids were useless. They thought we were nothing. I'm going to prove them wrong." Across human space, the same scene repeated in different ways. The Valkyrie had wanted to break humanity by attacking the weakest. Instead, they had given every human alive a reason to fight. The grandmother who had been ready to spend her last years in peace now had fire in her eyes. The teenager who had been thinking about school and friends now had purpose in his heart. Admiral Price addressed the coalition fleet on the day they launched their first counterattack. His words were broadcast to every human world. The Valkyrie believe that strength comes from removing the weak. They think that a society without children and elders is more efficient. Today, we will teach them the truth. Our strength does not come from what we can produce or what we can destroy. Our strength comes from what we protect. Every child, every grandparent, every single human life. That is what makes us strong. That is why we will win. The first coalition ships jumped into combat that same hour. The war had begun for real. And the Valkyrie were about to learn that they had made the worst mistake in the history of the galaxy. 6 months had passed since the massacre on Haven 7. The human response was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Admiral Samuel Price stood before the Coalition War Council with reports that would have seemed impossible just 1 year ago. "Our weapons production is up 400%, he announced. "Every factory is running day and night. Every shipyard is building new vessels. But what the Valkyrie never expected is who is doing the work." He changed the display on the screen. The faces that appeared were not young soldiers. They were old men and women, gray-haired and wrinkled, with fire in their eyes and tools in their hands. Betty Shaw was 73 years old. She had spent 30 years as a ship engineer before she retired to spend time with her grandchildren. Now she ran the retrofit division at Luna Shipyards. Under her command, old civilian transport ships were being turned into armed warships in half the time anyone thought possible. A reporter asked her how she was achieving such results. Betty just smiled and kept working while she answered, "Young engineers are smart and fast. But we old folks have something they don't have. We have experience. I've been fixing ships since before most of these kids were born. I don't need to look things up. I already know what works and what doesn't." She welded a panel into place with steady hands. "Besides, I don't need to run around the shipyard. I just sit at my station and make these ships deadly. Let the young ones do the running." The same pattern repeated across human space. Retired military officers returned to war rooms. Former intelligence agents came back from decades of quiet retirement to train new spies. Communities of elderly colonists who had built settlements from bare rock now used those same skills to build hidden supply bases. The Veltari had believed that removing the old would make humanity weaker. They had not understood that the old carried knowledge that could not be replaced. Dorothy Webb was 91 years old and used a hover chair to move around. Before her retirement, she had spent 40 years studying alien species. Now, she sat in the Coalition's strategy room, teaching young officers how to defeat an enemy she had studied for decades. The Veltari think in straight lines, Dorothy explained to the gathered commanders. Everything they do is based on efficiency. They cannot understand waste. They cannot understand sacrifice. She pulled up a display showing Veltari battle formations. Look at how they fight. Every ship stays in position. Every move is calculated to minimize losses. They never take risks because risks are inefficient. A young captain raised his hand. How does that help us? Dorothy smiled. It was not a nice smile. Because we are going to do things they cannot imagine. We are going to sacrifice ships to save other ships. We are going to throw away resources to gain advantages. They will not be able to respond because their brains cannot process what we are doing. Her plan was simple and brutal. Volunteer squadrons of elderly pilots would fly dangerous missions that drew enemy attention. While the Veltari focused on these old pilots, younger crews would move into position for killing strikes. The Veltari would not understand why humans would waste resources protecting people who could not fight effectively. The volunteers called themselves the Grey Wings. Their average age was 68. Their leader was Frank Cooper, 72 years old, with more flight hours than most pilots had in their entire careers. Frank had been retired for 10 years when the Veltari attacked. His grandson Benjamin had been 4 years old and had lived on Haven 7 with Frank's daughter. Benjamin had wanted to be a pilot like his grandpa when he grew up. He never got the chance. The first real test came at the Battle of Kepler Station. The Veltari sent a large fleet expecting a normal fight. Instead, they found the Grey Wings. Frank led 20 converted transport ships directly toward the enemy formation. His voice was calm as he opened communications. Attention Veltari Command. My name is Frank Cooper. You killed my grandson on Haven 7. He was 4 years old. His name was Benjamin. Frank's ship picked up speed, heading straight for the enemy flagship. I'm here to make introductions. The Veltari commander looked at the approaching ships and laughed. They were old transports flown by humans past their useful years. By Veltari logic, these people were already as good as dead. Why would anyone waste weapons on them? That was exactly what Betty Shaw had counted on. The transport ships reached optimal range and opened their cargo holds. Inside were weapon systems that Betty's teams had hidden behind fake cargo containers. The old transports became deadly warships in an instant. The Veltari never saw it coming. 6 of their cruisers exploded in the first attack. Their formation broke apart as panicked commanders tried to respond to an attack they could not understand. Why would humans send old people to fight? Why would they hide weapons in worthless ships? Frank Cooper survived that day. Not everyone in the Grey Wings was so lucky. 8 pilots gave their lives to open gaps in the enemy lines. Each one had known the risks. Each one had volunteered anyway. Peter Adams was 69. He rammed his burning ship into a Veltari command vessel when his weapons failed. Maria Santos was 71. She held her damaged ship in position, still firing, while younger pilots completed their attack runs. She never ejected. George Chun was 74. He used his transport as a shield to protect a wounded Coalition destroyer. He saved 200 lives with his sacrifice. When the battle ended, the Veltari had lost 12 ships. The Coalition had lost 4. And across human space, people who had thought their fighting days were over began to reconsider. News of the victory spread fast. The Grey Wings became heroes overnight. Old veterans who had been sitting in retirement homes watching the war on television began making calls to recruitment centers. If Frank Cooper can still fly, so can I, said one retired pilot who was 67. They think we're too old to matter, said another who was 70. Let me show them what old looks like. The Valkyrie commanders tried to understand what had happened. They reviewed the battle over and over. The humans had sent old, weak soldiers into combat. The humans had sacrificed valuable ships to save damaged ones. The humans had done everything wrong according to Valkyrie tactics, and the humans had won. Something was very wrong with their calculations. Something about humanity did not make sense. But the Valkyrie were not ready to admit that their entire understanding of the universe might be mistaken. That would come later. For now, they simply added more ships to their next attack fleet. Surely, they thought, more ships would solve the problem. They were wrong. 3 years had passed since the massacre on Haven 7. The war was over. The Valkyrie had surrendered. Now came the harder work of building peace. The surrender conference took place on a neutral space station, far from both human and Valkyrie territory. Admiral Samuel Price led the human delegation. His hair was fully gray now. The war had taken years from his life. But he stood tall, and his voice remained strong. Beside him sat the people who had made victory possible. Commander Lisa Monroe wore her dress uniform with pride. Captain Dennis Howard, who had liberated New Oslo, sat quietly reviewing his notes. Dr. Catherine Palmer, who had first explained Valkyrie thinking to the War Council, was there to help with negotiations. But the seats of highest honor went to 2 people who had never worn a military uniform. Betty Shaw was now 74 years old. Her hands were rough from years of shipyard work. She had personally helped build or repair over 200 vessels during the war. Sophie Barnes was 17. She had spent 3 years as an intelligence analyst after her rescue from New Oslo. Her insights had helped plan the final campaign against Velter Prime. The old woman and the young girl sat side by side, representing everything the Valkyrie had failed to understand. The Valkyrie delegation entered slowly. Their old government had collapsed after the defeat. The new leaders were reformers who had opposed the war from the beginning. They looked nervous and uncertain. Their lead negotiator was named Kethval. He was tall and thin, with the gray skin common to his species. His eyes moved around the room, studying each human face. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Kethval said carefully. "We have spent much time trying to understand where our calculations went wrong." He looked at Sophie, then at Betty. "Our strategists believed that removing your non-productive population would make humanity surrender. We calculated that you would negotiate once you lost what we called your dead weight." His voice carried genuine confusion. "We could not predict what actually happened." "Your response made no sense to us," Sophie leaned forward. Her voice was steady and clear, carrying the confidence of someone who had seen too much to be afraid of words. "That's because you counted people wrong," she said. "You measured them by what they could make or what they could destroy. We don't count people that way." She thought about her parents, who had died on Haven 7. She thought about the other children in the holding facility, the ones she had helped protect. She thought about Betty and Frank and all the old pilots who had flown into battle, knowing they might not come back. "My grandparents weren't productive by your standards," Sophie continued. "They couldn't work in factories. They couldn't fire weapons. But they taught me everything important. They showed me how to be brave. They showed me how to care about other people. When you killed them, you didn't remove something useless. You attacked the heart of what makes us human." Kethval was silent for a long moment. His species had no equivalent concept. In Valkyrie society, the old and young were kept alive only because they had been or would be useful. The idea that they had value simply by existing was completely foreign. "We do not understand," he admitted. Your behavior contradicts all efficient models. You sacrifice strong warriors to save weak civilians. You used resources to protect people who could not contribute. By our calculations, you should have lost. Lisa Monroe spoke next. Her voice was calm but firm. That's exactly why you lost, she said. You fought a war against people. We fought a war for people. There's no way you could have won that fight. The treaty negotiations lasted several weeks. The terms were extensive. The Valkyrie would pay reparations to help rebuild damaged colonies. They would reduce their military to defensive forces only. They would participate in cultural exchange programs designed to prevent future misunderstandings. But the most important term came from Betty Shaw. The old engineer stood up slowly, her joints aching from years of hard work. She walked to the center of the room and looked at the Valkyrie delegation. You want to understand humans? Fine, I'll tell you how to start. She pointed at Kethval. Build schools. Real schools, where young people learn to think and create and question. Not training centers, schools. She pointed at another delegate. Build places where your old people can rest without fear. Places where they are treated with respect, not thrown away when they stop being useful. Betty's voice grew stronger. You asked why we fight so hard for people who can't fight back. The answer is simple. Those people matter. A child matters because they are a child. An old person matters because they are a person. You don't have to earn the right to exist. The Valkyrie delegation agreed to her terms. Many of them admitted they still did not fully understand the concept. But they were willing to try. In the years that followed, the galaxy watched humanity rebuild. Haven 7 was reconstructed with help from dozens of colony worlds. Memorial gardens were planted with trees from 100 different planets. The names of every victim were carved into walls of white stone. Every year, survivors gathered to remember. Old veterans stood beside young children. Families who had lost everything came to honor those who were gone. Frank Cooper retired from the Grey Wings at age 75. He spent his remaining years training young pilots at the Coalition Academy. Every class learned tactics and strategy. But they also learned something more important. You don't fight for victory, Frank told them. You fight for the people who can't fight themselves. That's what makes us human. That's what makes us impossible to defeat. Sophie Barnes became the youngest admiral in Coalition history by age 30. When reporters asked about her rapid promotion, she always changed the subject. I just had good teachers, she would say. Some of them were 60 years older than me. Some of them were kids who didn't survive to see this piece. I carry all of them with me every day. Betty Shaw passed away at age 82, surrounded by family and friends. Her funeral was attended by thousands of people, including veterans from every campaign of the war. The ships she had built were still flying, still protecting human space. And across the galaxy, the lesson of the war was taught to every new generation. Humanity's greatest strength was not its weapons or its tactics. It was the simple truth that every person mattered. From the oldest grandmother to the youngest child, every life was worth protecting. The Valkyrie had tried to cut away what they saw as weakness. In doing so, they had revealed the one thing that made humanity truly unbeatable. It was a lesson the galaxy would never forget. 1 year after the massacre, the war had become a long and difficult fight. The Valkyrie had learned from their early defeats. They knew now that humans of all ages could be dangerous. But they still did not understand why. Lieutenant Commander Grace Young was 29 years old. Her job was supposed to be computer operations and cyber attacks. Instead, she found herself managing the strangest intelligence network in the history of warfare. They call themselves the Haven Kids, Grace explained to Admiral Price during her weekly report. They are children between 12 and 17 years old. They live in territories that the Valkyrie have occupied. and they are some of the best spies we have ever had." The Admiral looked at the screen, showing faces of teenagers and young children. "How is this possible? The Valkyrie should be watching everyone." Grace shook her head. "That's exactly the point, sir. The Valkyrie don't watch children. In their culture, anyone under 18 is considered non-functional. They literally do not see kids as capable of doing anything important. So they ignore them." Sophie Barnes was 14 years old. She lived in what remained of New Oslo, in a holding facility where the Valkyrie kept children whose parents had been killed in the attack. The Valkyrie did not know what to do with these orphans. They were too young to work. They were too young to fight. So they were simply kept in buildings and given food until someone decided their fate. Sophie had watched her parents die when the Valkyrie ships came. She had hidden in a basement while her neighborhood burned. When the enemy soldiers found her, they looked at her small body and young face and decided she was not worth killing. They put her in the holding facility and forgot about her. That was their mistake. Within 3 months, Sophie had built a communication network using parts she stole from broken equipment. The Valkyrie guards never searched the children. Why would they? What could a child possibly do with a broken radio? Sophie's messages reached Coalition intelligence 3 times a week. She reported everything she saw. How many ships landed at the spaceport? How many soldiers marched through the streets? What supplies were being moved and where they were going? "They talk in front of us like we're furniture," Sophie explained in one of her coded transmissions. "Officers discuss battle plans while we sweep the floors. They don't think we can understand what they're saying. So we listen. We remember. We report." On Brightwater Colony, 12-year-old twins Amy and Alex Cruz had found a different way to fight. The Valkyrie had turned their school building into a supply depot. The children who used to study there were now forced to clean the floors and carry boxes. The Valkyrie thought they were using worthless humans for simple tasks. They did not realize that Amy was memorizing every box she touched. Alex was mapping every room he cleaned. Together, the twins had created a complete picture of the enemy's supply system. When Coalition forces finally launched their attack on Brightwater, they knew exactly where to strike. Every important supply depot was destroyed in the first hour. The Valkyrie commanders could not understand how the humans had such perfect information. They never suspected the children. Grace Young spent long hours talking with the Haven kids through encrypted channels. She was amazed by their courage and their cleverness. These were not trained soldiers. They were boys and girls who should have been going to school and playing with friends. Instead, they were fighting a war with the only weapons they had: their eyes, their ears, and their memories. "We learned to look small," Amy Cruz told Grace after the liberation of Brightwater. "Not scared, but unimportant. The Valkyrie want to believe we are nothing, so we become nothing. And nothing sees everything." The intelligence from the Haven kids changed the course of the war. Coalition forces launched attacks based on information gathered by teenagers. Supply convoys were captured using routes mapped by children who had counted every patrol. But Sophie Barnes remained in occupied New Oslo for longer than any of the others. She refused to leave. "There are still kids here who need help," she transmitted to Grace. "I'm not leaving until everyone is safe." For 6 more months, Sophie ran her network from inside enemy territory. She recruited other children. She taught them how to watch and listen without being noticed. She organized an underground system that moved orphans to safer locations when the Valkyrie weren't looking. When Coalition Marines finally broke through to New Oslo, they expected to find terrified children needing rescue. Captain Dennis Howard led his team into the holding facility with medical supplies and comfort toys. What he found stopped him cold. Sophie Barnes stood in the main room, surrounded by a group of children sitting in neat rows. She was 14 years old and she had a tablet in her hand showing a map of the entire facility. "You're late," Sophie said calmly. "We disabled their security systems 3 days ago. The guards in the East Wing are locked in a storage room. The ones in the West Wing are tied up in the cafeteria. The kids did it while they were sleeping." Captain Howard stared at her. "You captured the guards?" Sophie shrugged like it was nothing special. "They underestimated us. Everyone does. We used that." The captain would later describe that moment as the most humbling experience of his military career. His team of trained Marines had come to rescue helpless children. Instead, they found that the children had already rescued themselves. When Sophie was finally brought to Coalition headquarters, she made one request. She wanted to keep working. She wanted to join the intelligence division and use what she had learned. "I know how they think now," Sophie explained to Admiral Price. "I know their weaknesses. I know what they don't see. Let me help end this war." The Admiral looked at this young girl who had done more damage to the enemy than entire battalions. She was 14 years old. She should have been worrying about school and friends. Instead, she had built a spy network that helped save millions of lives. "Welcome to Coalition Intelligence," the Admiral said. Sophie Barnes became the youngest analyst in human history. And in the months to come, her insights would help plan the final campaign against the Velthari homeworld. The children they had dismissed as worthless had become one of humanity's greatest weapons. 18 months after the Haven 7 massacre, the Coalition was ready. Operation Homecoming was the largest military action in human history. The goal was not just to free the occupied worlds. The goal was to carry the war into Velthari space itself. Admiral Samuel Price stood on the bridge of the carrier defiant. His hair had turned gray over the past year and a half. The weight of command had aged him, but his eyes were sharp and his voice was strong. Around him stood the people who had made this moment possible. Commander Lisa Monroe had transferred from ground combat to fleet operations. Betty Shaw had personally checked every ship in the Armada. And in the tactical section, Sophie Barnes led a team of young analysts who tracked enemy movements with impossible accuracy. "All ships report ready," Lisa announced. "The Grey Wings have volunteered to lead the attack." Samuel nodded. He was not surprised. The elderly volunteers always wanted the most dangerous jobs. They understood something that the Velthari could never grasp. A life spent building something worth defending was a life worth risking. "Jump coordinates confirmed," the navigation officer reported. "We have good intelligence on enemy positions." The Haven Kids Network provided the data. The Admiral took a deep breath. Thousands of ships waited for his order. Millions of humans had worked and fought and died to reach this moment. Children had spied. Grandparents had built weapons. People of every age had contributed everything they had. "Begin the jump," Samuel ordered. The fleet moved as one. In an instant, thousands of human ships appeared in Velthari space. What they found was better than anyone had hoped. The enemy homeworld of Velter Prime was defended by their entire remaining fleet. But the defensive formation was confused and disorganized. Ships were out of position. Command seemed slow and uncertain. Sophie Barnes figured out why within minutes. She was monitoring enemy communications and translating them in real time. "They're arguing," Sophie reported with amazement in her voice. "Their high command is fighting with itself. Half of them want to surrender. The other half want to keep attacking our civilians. They still don't understand why their strategy failed." Admiral Price allowed himself a small smile. The Velthari had built their entire war plan on the idea that killing the weak would break humanity. When that plan failed, they had no backup. They had no ability to adapt. Their way of thinking could not process a species that valued every life equally. "All ships, begin attack," the Admiral ordered. The Grey Wings led the charge. Frank Cooper, now 73, flew at the head of his squadron. His converted transport ship had been upgraded many times over the past year. Betty Shaw had personally installed his weapon systems. "All wings, this is Grey Leader," Frank transmitted. "Remember Haven 7. Remember every child and every grandparent they killed. Remember why we're here. Now let's finish this." The first wave hit the Valkyrie defensive line like a hammer. The elderly pilots flew without fear. They had already lived full lives. They were ready to give whatever was needed. Frank's squadron drew the attention of 3 Valkyrie cruisers. The enemy commanders saw old humans in converted civilian ships and made the same mistake they had made at Kepler Station. They dismissed the Grey Wings as unimportant threats. Hidden weapons revealed themselves. Coalition destroyers moved into position while the enemy focused on the wrong targets. The Valkyrie formation began to collapse, but the Grey Wings paid a price. Kenneth Ross was 69. His ship took heavy damage in the first exchange. Instead of retreating, he flew his burning vessel directly into the bridge of a Valkyrie command ship. His last transmission was calm and steady. "Tell my grandkids I love them." Ross out. Helen Park was 71. She held her position even as her engines failed, continuing to fire until younger ships could complete their attack runs. She ejected at the last second, but her escape pod was hit by debris. She did not survive. William Grant was 68. He used his ship as a shield to protect a damaged medical frigate carrying wounded soldiers. The frigate escaped. William did not. Each death was mourned. Each sacrifice was remembered. But the battle continued. By the third hour, the Valkyrie defensive line had broken completely. Coalition forces pushed toward Velter Prime itself. The enemy high command watched in disbelief as everything they believed fell apart around them. Admiral Price opened the channel to the Valkyrie Supreme Council. His face appeared on every screen on their planet. "This is Admiral Samuel Price of the Terran Coalition. I want to make sure you understand what is happening today." He paused, letting his words sink in. "You attacked our elderly because you thought they were weak. You killed our children because you thought they were worthless. Your strategists calculated that removing these populations would make humanity easier to defeat." The Admiral's voice grew harder. "You were wrong. You didn't weaken us. You united us. Every grandmother who picked up a welding torch. Every grandfather who returned to the cockpit. Every child who became a spy. Every single person you dismissed as non-functional became another reason why we are standing in your space today." The Valkyrie Council members watched in silence. Some of them were beginning to understand. Most were still confused. "You tried to cut away our weakness," Admiral Price continued. "Instead, you showed us how strong we really are. Humanity does not measure strength by who can work or fight. We measure strength by what we protect. And we will protect everyone. Always." The Valkyrie Supreme Council did not respond. They had nothing to say. The battle for Velter Prime lasted another 6 hours. The human fleet pushed forward without stopping. Every time the Valkyrie tried to reorganize, Coalition forces disrupted them. Every time they tried to retreat, the Grey Wings cut off their escape. Frank Cooper survived the battle. He landed his damaged ship on the Defiant as the last Valkyrie warship surrendered. When he climbed out of the cockpit, Admiral Price was waiting for him. "Hell of a fight," Frank said simply. "Hell of a flight," the Admiral replied. By midnight, the Valkyrie fleet had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The war was not quite over, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Humanity had won, and across the galaxy, in retirement homes and schools and family homes, people celebrated. The old and the young had proven their worth in the most decisive way possible. They had helped win a war,